Good afternoon, and welcome to the BCMA's first program of the new fall semester. I'm Frank Goodyear, and I have the pleasure of co-directing the Bowdoin College Museum of Art with my wife, Ann Collins Goodyear. We hope that you will join us throughout the fall for a variety of virtual programs. For though the Bowdoin campus and the museum are unfortunately closed to the public at the moment, we remain open as an educational resource for faculty and students and the wider community. Please be sure to check out the online Visit from Home offerings on the museum's website. And if you are not already a member, please consider signing up. It's the best way to keep up to date with what's happening at the museum. This afternoon, we're thrilled to welcome Walter Smalling, a celebrated photographer from Washington, D.C. and Penobscot, Maine, who has spent nearly 3 decades photographing American architecture for numerous organizations, including the National Park Service and the National Register of Historic Places. During this time, he has published more than a dozen books. 5 years ago, Walter began a conversation with Ann and me about a book that would examine the places in Maine that mattered to artists. The goal was to realize this book in 2020 in conjunction with the 200th anniversary of Maine's statehood. After partnering with the New York publisher Rizzoli, we decided to focus our attention on artist homes and studios here in Maine. With the help of Earl Shuttleworth, Maine's state historian, and Michael Komanecki, the chief curator at the Farnsworth Art Museum, we researched more than 100 significant artists associated with the state. Because the book was meant to explore the idea of place, we chose to focus our attention on those artists whose homes and/or studios still stood. Fortunately, here in Maine, there are many such buildings. In the end, we chose 26 artists from the past 200 years. The book, At First Light, 2 Centuries of Maine Artists, Their Homes and Studios, with an introduction by Stuart Kastenbaum, Maine's poet laureate, came out last March, just as the state was shutting down. The book serves as a companion to the exhibition At First Light, 2 Centuries of Artists in Maine, which was supposed to have opened last June, but which we hope to realize next summer. It promises to be a great exhibition, and we hope to see you then. We should also mention that a selection of Walter's photographs will be included in that presentation. This afternoon, we will begin with a 23-minute recorded presentation by Walter. Afterwards, we will return for a live question and answer session. If you have a question, please don't hesitate to pose it using the Q&A function on Zoom. Thanks again for joining us. That said, without further delay, let's hear from Walter.
The Maine countryside has an untamed quality to it. There are endless forests, and no matter where you go in Maine, you are not far from water. Either the ocean, a lake, or a river. These very facts make Maine so alluring to artists, not only the wilderness, but the quality of light reflected off water, whether near or far, light unlike anywhere else. Hi, I'm Walter Smalling, the photographer for At First Light, and these are from my notes in the book. In the summer months of 2018, my partner Ray and I drove 5,000 miles in search of the artists who had come for that light. From as far south as Ogunquit, Charles Woodbury, and Falmouth, David Driscoll, to the edge of the world at Cape Split, John Marin, to the northern wilderness, William Wegman. They inhabited very different places and made homes and studios, setting up places to live and work. For if there's one thing in common among the 26 artists whose lives we recorded, it was their commitment to their art and the hard work that made them rise to the top of a very large mountain. It is not easy to become a recognizable household name in the art world, and even less common to make a comfortable living doing it. Sometimes I felt like a honeybee going from one flower to another, carrying a story, information, goodwill, even some gossip. From the dead, I searched for a story, listened to the voices from the past. From the living, I found inspiration, learned lessons, and was often just plain old entertained. Because I have often done work as a photographer in historic preservation, going to old houses belonging to artists from the past felt very familiar to me. I have a system. I go into a house and I sit down and I wait till the place speaks to me, and I hear those voices from the past. I can see what eyes had seen sometimes 100 years ago, sometimes decades, what brought people here and what inspired them. Making this book was a little bit like playing in a classical music quartet. Each musician had their own instrument and each played their own part to make the whole. We were very lucky. We had three very knowledgeable and brilliant art historians and museum professionals, Ann Collins Goodyear, Frank Goodyear, and Michael Kamenicki. And we were marking with this book the 200th anniversary of the founding of the state of Maine. On March 15th, 1820, the Missouri Compromise was signed, making it a state. We traveled around so many miles, more than 5,000, because it was very important to me what light the photographs were taken in. And so oftentimes we would go to a place 150 miles away from my hometown of Penobscot, and we would take photographs in the early dawn, and then maybe we would stay and take photographs in the evening, but I still wouldn't have what I wanted, so we would go back again. So thus so many miles. We were going in circles around the state. We decided to start in our own backyard in Blue Hill. Jonathan Fisher arrived from Harvard in 1796 as an intern and eventually became the minister of the Congregational Church in Blue Hill. He was a remarkable man because he could do most anything. The house that you see here, which now sits just a few, quote, city blocks from a grocery store in nearby a busy road, looks very much like it would have when he built it, along with some help from his congregation. But Fisher could also build furniture. So everything you see in these photographs, he built by hand himself. And he often even made the tools that he made the furniture with. But he was also a very fine artist. Many of those paintings are in the collection of the Farnsworth Museum now. And he also was kept in extensive records of life at that time and made charts that were quite beautiful. One of my jobs is to tell a story that is not always there. In recreating studios, sometimes I would go to an artist studio and I'd find that it had been turned into a very comfortable Airbnb space, and consequently that didn't work for my purposes because I was trying to show what it looked like when the artist was working there. So one case in point was Charles Woodbury's studio in Ogunquit. And the owner of it, Marcia Beale Brazier, was very kind and took a great leap of faith when I asked her if we could just simply empty out the studio and start over again. There's a story that I've always liked called Stone Soup, and it's basically about soldiers who pass through a town after a war, and the townspeople are afraid that they're going to eat everything, all the food that they have. And so they hide it all in cellars and basements, and that when the soldiers come through, they're hungry, and one of them says, does anybody have a pot and a stone? And so they bring a pot, they start a fire, they get it hot, he drops the stone in it, and after a while he takes a taste of it and says, delicious, but it would be so much better if we had some carrots. So somebody goes and they bring the carrots. And then he says, it would be even better with some potatoes and then some beef, and they all bring that to him. And next thing you know, they have a complete stew. And that's the way it worked with Woodbury's studio. The Woodbury boys, as we called them, who were Charles Woodbury's grandsons, remembered their grandfather's studio very well. And they told me at lunch one day that they had a lot of the things that were in his studio, from paintings to sculpture to just artifacts, things that he liked to look at. And so over the course of a couple of days, it was like Stone Soup. They appeared in their cars with more and more things, easels, paintings, and we put them into the space, and you get now what you see in the photograph. Sometimes it was also a matter of actually finding the artist, him or herself. The case of Marston Hartley, which is infamous because he was a man who was very much a single man who never even really had a home. He was born in Maine, in Lewiston, and he died in Maine, in Ellsworth. And he decided late in life that he was going to come back to Maine and call himself the painter of Maine, which he succeeded in doing. And he, at the end of his life, landed up in Korea, in the Skutik Peninsula. And this is the church that's in his famous painting of the White Church. And this was across the street from where he was renting a room. He actually had a studio in the upstairs of this church. And I discovered in talking to a friend in my hometown who lived in Brooksville and on a farm called Bagaduce Farm. And lo and behold, it turned out, she said, that Marston Hartley had spent several months there. He had a show at Stiglitz's 291 Gallery in New York City, and it didn't do well, it didn't sell. And so he was a bit desperate, and a woman named Claire Evans, whom he knew, lived in Bagaduce Farm and invited him to come and spend time with them. She was the best friend of Georgia O'Keeffe, and here's a little sidebar that is fascinating. She was also the daughter-in-law of Mabel Dodge. So Marston Hartley spent several months there, and he painted one of his very well-known paintings of the nephew of the Evans, who was a student at Yale, and it's of him as a swimmer sitting on the rocks there. And this is the bedroom that he slept in, and the same bed is still there, and the desk with the paint smudges on it where he worked. And of course, he's most famous for some of his images of Mount Katahdin in Baxter State Park. And so we made several trips to Baxter and hiked in to Dacey Pond in order to get some of the pictures at the same time of the year that he painted. However, the views are not really the same because the state of Maine has grown up, the tree cover, very thickly compared to what it was 100 years ago. We also went to Monhegan, again, Rockwell, Kent. This is his studio there, and this is the living room of his small house. But he also built a house for his mother, the house that Jamie Wyeth now owns. Then the Wyeths, 3 generations of the Wyeths, and they lived in several different places, but this had been the home of N.C. Wyeth until his untimely death, and it's called 8 Bells. It's in Port Clyde, and after his death, Andrew Wyeth moved with his family there, and in later years, Helga spent, of the famous paintings of Helga, spent her summers there at this house. Also, the Olson House, which is practically an icon unto itself, because one of the most famous paintings in the world is Christina's World, that was painted here by Andrew Wyeth at this house. And I loved photographing this because the house still, even though the furniture is no longer there, it still feels like the old Olson homestead. And Jamie Wyeth told me that when he was a boy, when his father would go to paint, he would play there, and so knew the house very well and thought of it as almost a second home. Another place, another island where we went, and then we were traveling miles nautically, was to Great Spruce Head Island, which was the family home, summer home of Elliott Porter and Fairfield Porter. And it still is occupied by members of the Porter family, some of whom have gone to the house for the summer for their entire lifetimes. And you still cook by a wooden stove. There's almost no electricity in the house. And I was lucky enough to spend several weeks there. This is the big room in the big house, as it's known. It has 12 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms. And this is a room where the family gathered. And as you can see, it's quite spectacular. And then we moved to Lois Dodd. Lois was one of my favorite stops in the whole book. We became very good friends, and I have visited her now at her home in East Village, where a very unpretentious woman is the same in New York City as she is in Cushing, Maine, in her house. And this is her in her studio. And one of the things I loved about Lois is that when I took this picture of her bloomers on the clothesline, she was actually very amused by it, and I think liked the fact that it was in the book. Not many people would have allowed that. This is the guest room in her house, and you can see there's a lot of hand-painted surfaces, and it is truly an artist's house. There's a little sculpture in the foreground which was made by her former husband, Bill King. Down the road from Lois's house is Bernard Langley's house. And one of the nice things about this, it's one of the places in Maine where anybody can go to see the artist and where he lived and worked. And there is an outdoor sculpture garden that you can go to at any time of the day, well, any time of the day. And this is a sort of a satirical Christina, who, as we know, was seen crawling up the lawn at the Olson House. This photograph is a portrait of Bob Indiana in his kitchen in the building on Vinyl Haven Island that was called the Star of Hope. It was a former International Order of Oddfellows building, and he told me that he bought the building in part because after he went to see it, he was told that Marston Hartley had had a studio and had lived in the building across the street, and that sealed his purchase. He had his entire life's work in this building and had saved everything that had ever been written about him, and it was in an archives there. He also, a little sidebar, when I arrived on the island, it was late at night on a very wintry, icy night, and there in his truck was Robert Indiana waiting to pick me and my assistant up. And when I told this to someone, they said, Bob Indiana would never do that. And I said, well, he did. And we hit it off. We had a great time. We spent a week in the house and we talked at length about many things. But we also took a lot of photographs. And basically, the photographs that we took during that week are now the only surviving images of what the building looked like when Robert Indiana was still alive and working in the building. And here is the photographer again, this time in the studio of Winslow Homer in Prout's Neck in Maine. And this was an incredible privilege because what I'm looking at right here is the very window that Winslow Homer looked out of his studio at the sea, and when he watched the ocean and painted it. So here is the Ark, which was originally a stable that belonged to the Homer family. It was a few hundred feet away from this spot where it was moved, and he had it altered to be his home and his studio. And except for making trips to southern climes every year, this is where he lived out the rest of his life. And here's the way it looked before he altered it. This is him, the only known picture of him in his studio. This is the living room in the Ark on a wintry day with some snow on the ground, and this is the view that he saw if he was standing in his living room looking out at the ocean. The close of the day at Prout's Neck. And it was a great privilege to spend time there because one of the perks of being a photographer is that you can have the museum let you into the space when nobody else is there. It's a little bit like my night in the museum. One of my great privileges also was photographing David Driscoll in Falmouth. And I discovered from my sister recently something that I didn't know, and that is that my great grandparents were married in 1735 in the church in Falmouth, Maine, which was then Massachusetts. The Bradburys and the Foggs married together. And so to me, it was a perfect symmetry that now I was back in Falmouth with David Driscoll, with whom I became quite good friends. And David died this summer, which is a great loss. He was an incredible educator and artist. And here he built a house that I said when I first saw it, I said, David, you're from Georgia, and what you've done is you've recreated a holler in Georgia here in Falmouth, Maine. And this was his house up in the trees. And then his studio here is one he made himself. He built both of them. and he made this from leftover parts from a lot of different places. When we toured the gardens, he told me that he brought seeds and trees from everywhere he traveled, from important people and important places, and he called them memory trees when he planted them in his own garden in Maine. Also, one of the great pleasures of doing this book was meeting and spending time with Ashley Bryan. Ashley turned 97 this year, and he lives and has lived for several decades alone in a house on Little Cranberry Island. And when we spent the day with him, I said that the inside of the house reminded me of what the inside of Ashley's brain probably was. It was wonderful that all of the different things that he has collected, and the place where he makes his art, which is not only graphic art but also stained glass windows and other objects, dolls, and he did a series on reinventing the lives of slaves and what might have happened to them had it not gone the way it did. But here is Ashley with his great nephew, and it was a great privilege spending time with him on Little Cranberry. This now is Molly Neptune Parker, who is probably the preeminent Native American basket maker, certainly in North America. And unfortunately, very tragically, we lost Molly this summer also. But it was amazing to me because she lived such a simple life. The days we were there visiting her, she had a constant flow of visitors, and I was aware of somebody who was not only a leader in her craft and in her art, but also in the Passamaquoddy tribe, of which she was a member and a leader. And all day long, family and friends came to see her and seek counsel. And we watched her making a basket, and I was surprised by my partner Ray a couple of months later when he had secretly made plans with Molly to send me a birthday present of one of her baskets, which looks very much like this one on the left, one of her signature flower baskets. Another one of the really fun times that we had during this more than 5,000 mile odyssey was visiting William Wegman and his wife Christina. Bill had found an old inn in the Rangeley Lake area and had bought it years ago, along with several of the cabins and buildings on the property. And he uses this as his summer home and as his studio. And we stayed there actually with them in one of the cabins. And Flo and Topper, two of the Weimaraners in a long line of dogs over the years, were there present. And it was a beautiful space and a lot of fun to be there. The Wegmans were extremely nice and gracious hosts. And one of the things that I'll always love Bill Wegman for was when I was there taking these photographs, I had a leg injury. And I was running behind him trying to get a photograph that I knew would be a good one, but I wasn't fast enough and I missed it. And at one point he figured out what was happening and he turned around to me and said, "Anything we do, Walter, we can do again." And I became a lifelong fan. But here's the living room of the lodge. You can see the dogs and Bill outside the door. And here is also the costume room where there were probably maybe almost thousands of dresses and coats and clothes that he cut holes in the arms so that the dogs could be standing inside the clothes and he could have human hands come around the dogs. And everyone who knows Wegman's photographs knows the way in which he did that. And here is one of the dogs looking out at the lake. And here's my photograph of the lake, our last day there. This is my portrait of Richard Tuttle. When we arrived at his property on Mount Desert Island, I was astonished because I thought there was nothing there. Eventually, walking around, I realized that there were several temporary looking buildings, actually. This here is the bedroom that was hanging over the cliff on the edge of the beach, and actually a big storm would have taken it out. It was on stilts, and the same was true with all of the buildings, and there was an outdoor shower. Richard and I spent several hours walking the beaches and the property, and he explained to me that his studio was the land, and that's where he got inspiration and also where he often worked and used the things from that land. There are many other artists in the book, but Maine became a force for American art. And many artists would come to Maine, spend the summer, and then go back to New York or wherever and extol the virtues of this beautiful place, this wild country with incredible light and a lot of things to paint. And eventually they came in such numbers that there were colonies and there were schools in Maine. But over the course of 200 years, it was really always one theme that brought them all together. They came and they saw this incredible light, and it inspired all of them. It was always the light.
Walter, thank you so much for describing your experiences photographing the homes and studios of several of the artists included in this book. Your impressions as an artist yourself are absolutely fascinating, and we're so excited to have this opportunity to learn more. And on that note, I'd like to encourage everybody who is participating in this program to please send your questions in. We look forward to hearing from you. I'm going to take advantage of my prerogative as the moderator of this program to begin, Walter, with a photograph, rather with a question about your own practice as a photographer. One of the things that really stood out to me as I listened to your reflections about your experience working on this book were your comments about the light. And I couldn't help but reflect that light, of course, is essential to the practice of photography, which itself actually means to write with light if we look at its etymology. And I wondered if you would be willing to talk a little bit about how you worked with light itself as a medium and the role that your sensitivity to light may have played in crafting the narrative that your images describe as one goes through the book.
Well, thank you, Anne. I think about N.C. Wyeth, who used to, I think, felt that he was, even though he was very famous as an illustrator and was known for that, that he wanted to be known more as an artist. And sometimes I think I work sort of in reverse. I like to think that sometimes my craft rises to art, but that what's most important to me is communication. I think I use my photographs because there's a story that I want to tell. And so I find that the light is so evocative for people. I think that it really gives a sense of a place, of a time, of where you are. And so I have always paid particular attention to that. I know some photographers look at it as it's more about a graphic issue. For me, it's more about a mood, a sense of communicating something rather subtle and perhaps almost unspoken. And so all the years that I've been taking photographs, I have used a lot of artificial light, but my goal, I hope that I succeed most of the time, is that even though I may have brought suitcases full of lights and put them up to light a scene, you still would not really know it, that it would still have the sense of natural light. And I'm not as interested in the manipulation of a scene as I am in what it communicates and what people can see in it and what they understand and how it makes them feel, perhaps, is an important issue.
Walter, along those lines, one of the questions that has just come in, and this bears on your practice as a photographer, so I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to work my way back to some other of the questions that have come in. but one of our listeners wants to know whether you and Bill Wegman, both being photographers, spoke about the practice of photography with one another.
Well, yes, we did indeed some, because as you can imagine, life around the lodge there was pretty quiet, and there was a lot of time to talk. But one of the things that I was very clear about when I got there, somebody there with me said, well, you know, you could do this because it looks a little bit like the way Bill had done it. And I thought, no, that wasn't the issue at all. I was here not to try and imitate him because he did something so extraordinarily well. Why should I try and compete with that? But I think that Bill is also a moving picture artist. I mean, he does a lot of videos. I think he's quite well known for that. And so, you know, I felt like I was there again to tell a story. And I think Bill, his photographs also are about telling a story, but they're plays on a story. They're almost like jokes, I guess you could say, or they're plays on photographs or on words. And so anyway, I was trying not to compete with him, but to describe his world and his life and how he interacted with the dogs.
Thank you so much. And another question that has come up is the question of both the artists who we were able and lucky enough to include in this book, and of course that question of the fish who get away, the question of artists who in an ideal world we would have liked to have included in this book. And so one of our listeners was interested to hear, Walter, from your perspective, who were we not able to include, and who do you wish we could have?
Well, I think that in Georgetown, there was quite a little art settlement there with a number of photographers, including Clarence Day and a number of others. And it would have been very interesting to have had more of them in the book. But I think perhaps you could say, as is so often the case in something like this, is that there is another book waiting to be done. We did also try to include Neil Oliver, for instance, who I felt like was very important to the story of art in Maine in the 20th century, and that just didn't work out. But I think that when we started out, and Anne, you and Frank would remember this, I think the long list was over 100 artists. And we just kept narrowing it down because, well, it was kind of necessary. It would have been easy to have done everything sort of geographically. Like, for instance, there were a number of artists working on Mount Desert Island that we could have included in the book. There were a number of people through Skowhegan that we could have included in the book, because obviously these are two places that are very important to the story of art in Maine. But again, you ultimately do have to narrow it down. And my thought is, there's another book.
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to turn this question over to my co-director and co-author, Frank, who I know has some thoughts to share as well.
But you know, there were some artists, Walter, who came to Maine, whether early sort of pioneers like Thomas Cole, who made some of the first, one of the first sort of European American artists to picture the landscape of Maine. But we're not altogether sure where he necessarily stayed. Or even in the 20th century, we know that Georgia O'Keeffe spent time in Maine. But again, the question of, was there a home or studio that was associated with her, sort of missed
Louise
us.
Nevelson, another one.
Louise Nevelson, for sure. And again, you know, we're so fortunate to be living in a state that has so many, you know, extraordinary living artists. And we felt as though we could have done a whole volume on the extraordinary artists, the Kathy Bradfords, the John Walkers, the Richard Estes of the world, who we would love to have done something with. So
Sure.
we had to make some difficult choices.
Tough choices, yeah.
We got a question from the audience about how long did this project take you? We know that you traveled nearly 6,000 miles to do this. You know, when did you get started? When did you sort of feel like you had got what you were looking for?
Well, I mean, I was just going to say it on the last end of your, what you were just saying is that Earl Shuttleworth is rather extraordinary in that he was able to pull up from memory a lot of the places that still existed, where an artist's house and studio was, where it was still intact. And I think that the job was basically, we had a year to do it. I think that's one of the things that people often say to me, well, you know, how did you do this? How did you go about doing it? And I think that, again, I did have the luxury of sort of doing this circular thing of going somewhere, feeling like I'd gotten the images that I wanted, but I was missing something. You know, maybe it was the storm on the ocean, which I, interestingly enough, during this whole year, I kept waiting for a big storm that I might take photographs of, and there really was not one that sort of presented itself at the right time. But I think that it's also sort of like, I think, a painter who works on a canvas. There's a moment when you know you have it, and maybe you feel that the story has been told. And I think there's always some regrets, but I've always been pretty good about knowing that, okay, I think I've got this in the can, as they say, that I think I've told the story well enough that I can convey it to a reader who's not there. Because that's one of the criteria for me always. And I think that it helped, having done a lot of magazine work over the years, that I have to take for granted that the person who is looking at the book will probably never be in the place where I am. And I think that if I've conveyed a story or something about the person, then I know I've got it.
Walter, thanks so much for your thoughts. A related question came up, which has to do with what it means for you now to reflect back on this project. And the question is, which artist's space haunts your memory, both visually and emotionally?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I connected with Jonathan Fisher quite a bit because I felt like the house was sort of haunted by his just such a strong personality that was there, and that made a real impression on me. It also is rather nice that I go by that house quite frequently. In fact, when I go to the grocery store here, leaving Penobscot and going into Blue Hill, I pass by that house, and certainly that had a strong effect on me. I think very often places where the artists have died and the house still has a very strong sense of that person. I know I was at one point the photographer for Monticello, and on a couple of occasions I was locked into that house, or not locked into that house, but I was in that house when nobody else was there and when it was dark and closed up. And I always had the idea that any minute this tall redheaded man who was exactly my size might walk into the room with me. And I think that going into some of the houses where the artists had passed, as it were, definitely, you know, spoke to me, and I think, you know, haunted me a bit. But then there was the incredible energy of people like a Lois Dodd or an Ashley Bryan or William Wegman that also created a very strong impression. And well, it was an incredible privilege to work on this book because I got to go places that I wouldn't have ever been otherwise, and also to meet people who I admired. You know, Jamie Wyeth, I have always admired his well, the entire family, but I've admired his work because I thought he had such an interesting place. I asked him at one point whether he felt that it was a burden that having his name, but he said no, not at all, because he loved his father and he admired his grandfather. And I think that having that ability to talk to people about things, but also to listen to the past in places where the people were no longer there. I don't know that that answers it or not, but I think that it certainly, it was profound being in some of these places and working on the book, quite frankly.
We've gotten a couple of comments about people who want us to do a similar book about Maine writers, because of course Maine is famous for its poets, its novelists, its nonfiction writers, and I think that sounds like an interesting idea. But what are you working on now?
Well, just in Maine, there's a couple of things that I still have kind of on the back burner. One of the things that I've always been very interested in is the fact that so much of Maine has been, well, there's a lot of Maine that lives in the past, and we also, of course, we move forward. But when in the golden age between like 1890 and 1920, a lot of families came to Maine and built houses that they furnished and became summer houses, or were summer houses, and then were passed down in the family. And so I've come to think of them as being like time capsules. And I think that it would be very interesting to do a book on the time capsules of Maine, where things were installed, houses were built, and they really have almost not changed at all. And that's pretty unusual. I know there probably are some other vacation spots in the United States where people also were very careful to not change things, because I think all of us who might live in the city sometimes and come to a quiet place like the idea that nothing ever changes. I think it sometimes can drive young people in Maine crazy because they feel that it needs to change more. But that time capsule is such an interesting thing, and the idea of doing a book that would look at that interests me a great deal. So that's one of the things that's sort of there on the back burner.
Absolutely, Walter. And in terms of thinking about projects that you're working on now, there's also a great deal of interest being expressed by attendees about the history of your own photographic practice. People are interested to know how you became interested in photography. People are interested to know whether you ever used an iPhone with any of the pictures that you were capturing. And then also there are folks who are interested in knowing about whether you use photographic film and or whether you use digital processes.
Well, I'm often reminded that sometimes life's change on a tiny moment, that one little event happens and changes our lives completely. I mean, we know this happens with everybody, sometimes changing in bad ways and sometimes in good ways. I was in school to study architecture, and this had been my dream since I was a little kid. At one point, I think I could probably name every house that Frank Lloyd Wright had designed and what year it was built. When I got into school, my parents one Christmas decided that I needed to have a camera because, as they said, an architect should know how to take pictures. And so they gave me a pretty decent 35 millimeter camera, and I decided to take a class at college in photography. And I enjoyed it, and the professor said, you know, you seem to have an eye for this. Maybe you should keep this up. And so I basically began to shift more toward photography. And as it happened, I combined architecture, which was my interest, and photography, becoming an architectural photographer. And so a large part of my work, although not all of it, through my career, which now is pushing, alas, on almost 40 years, has been architectural photography. But I also, well, you asked about the digital and the film. I was very slow to come to digital photography because I was so sort of immersed in the culture of film. A lot of my work was done in historic preservation. And so one of the things that was very important was the archival quality of film and the ability to keep a record of buildings that might be torn down or might be gone, and the ability to look at a negative and be able to see the building and reproduce it if you wanted to do it. And I felt like digital was such an ephemeral thing that whole sense of the negative as the object that held the history was gone, because my feeling still is that there will come a day when, quite frankly, our digital images will be gone. I really do believe that. And I know that the Library of Congress now tells photographers that if you have images you really want to keep, you want to put them on archival paper and store them in a cool, dark place. And I thought, here we are, right back at 1909 again. And so I did come to digital photography rather slowly, but then I realized what you could do with it, which is just almost a miracle, considering that film, that it's, well, it's just that you can do so much more with it. It's the ability of a digital camera to pick up light and to record things that even the finest film in some ways lost. But they're two different things. I mean, obviously, and do I still shoot film? Occasionally, yes. And I do. I think it's like anybody who has been working in a field for a lot of years, you get a little sentimental about the things you did when you were younger, because, you know, maybe everything was better when you were younger. So film seemed better because you were using it when you were younger. And I do go back to it occasionally, but there's no question that the digital camera has capabilities that we just never had before. Absolutely.
Walter, another question that has come up, I think, which is reflecting on your great ability as a storyteller, is whether there are any stories you have not yet been able to tell about your experience that you'd like to share this evening.
Well, one of the things, and we were looking at the cover of the book, which I think is really funny to me, that that house on the cover is, of course, a house on Monhegan that Rockwell Kent built for his mother, and has now been owned for many years by Jamie Wyeth. And when I see that picture, all I can think of is the fact that between the two upstairs windows in the bedrooms is Jamie Wyeth hiding out of sight in the window, and he's yelling at me out way out on the rocks in the foreground, "Walter, is this bright enough?" So that's one of the things that will always stick in my mind. And again, just the ability to sit and talk to Ashley Bryan, a man who is truly timeless, and to be quiet with him and to listen to him tell his stories was something that is just immeasurable in its importance to me, and to and an opportunity to have done that, which is just amazing. And also, I must say, working with my three authors, we developed a friendship, and it was great. It was such a nice interaction and cooperation, and we, interestingly enough, because I've done, actually, it's about, I think, almost 20, maybe 26 books now from the beginning of my career. And there have been times when it's been very difficult, and sometimes, things, I can say that honestly, things always ended well with everybody I ever worked with, but there were times when it was tough. But with this book, with you, Anne, and with Frank, and with Michael, it was just always a pleasure to get together and discuss the book, and to talk about what we were doing and where we were heading. What do they say? It's priceless. So, it was a terrific experience.
Walter, thank you so much for your kind comments. We thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to work with you. And of course, the conversations that we had as co-collaborators on this book. And I think the art historians were deeply informed, just as deeply informed by your creative work as a photographer as you may have been by some of our observations. One of the things that we of course tried to do was to balance our representation of artists in Maine as much as we could in terms of thinking about men and women and artists from different traditions as well as artists from different parts of the state. You, of course, have spent many years yourself here in Maine as an artist, as a painter, and as a photographer. And I wonder if you might be able to share with us whether there was anything that you yourself learned about Maine through this project that hadn't yet revealed itself to you.
Well, Maine is to say the least, is a very special place. And I think we're all aware of that very much right now during the pandemic, because we are in a place of refuge almost, I think, being here in Maine. But one of the things that was so nice about doing the book was the fact that I really did go all around the state and to a lot of nooks and crannies, and to see the variety of places, to see the natural beauty that is still amazingly untouched, was a bit of a revelation. I mean, again, I came here by choice. A lot of us who are in Maine come by choice. I always said that in Washington, where I obviously spend a lot of time, people were there because they had to be there, because their jobs were there. In Maine, it's exactly the opposite. You know, we're in Maine first, and sometimes the nuclear physicist who is a shopkeeper. We then find the jobs because we want to be in Maine, and the job comes second. The ones who are really lucky are the ones like me and like you who can be in Maine and have a job that we really enjoy, that really inspires us and excites us. But I think that the diversity of people, the kindness of people, that there's really no question that when you're in a place where it's beautiful and it's quiet, you're more, it makes you a better person. And we may be running out of time, it looks like.
Yeah, no. But I was just going to say, as a final concluding thought, what I've learned from this project is that place really matters to an artist, and your photographs made evident insights about these individuals and their artistic practice. It's really quite wonderful, and we encourage people to visit next summer when At First Light the exhibition happens. But there's such an extraordinary variety of artistic forms, materials, traditions that are reflected in the art. And the exhibition will include paintings and photographs and prints and drawings and watercolors and different craft traditions and video and sculpture. It's exciting that we live in a state that has such extraordinary diversity in its midst. I was sort of reflecting, could you do this book about any other state? And yes, of course you could, but I think no book would be as certainly beautiful as this one. On the state of Maine.
Just the natural beauty is extraordinary. There is no question, and so we're question. And I hope that maybe the photographs do tell us something about not only the art but the place.
Absolutely, and we are thrilled that when we do our exhibition next summer, there will be it should be acknowledged. 2 exhibitions. It's really not even enough to do 2 exhibitions to capture the breadth of what we've tried to achieve, but we also are very excited that we'll have a dedicated show on view of Walter's photographs. So of course they reproduce very beautifully in the book. Walter has been kind enough to share these with us this evening, but we're going to give you an opportunity to see them in the flesh when you visit us next summer. We're looking forward to celebrating the one to grow on, Maine's 201st in 2021. And we have, I think, all been very privileged to work together on At First Light, Walter and Frank and Michael and myself. And that collaboration makes us very keenly aware of the many other collaborators who have been part of the process of making this book possible. We are so grateful to the extraordinary artists who have supported us, the archivists, our wonderful team of editors and publicists at Rizzoli, who have been such a pleasure to work with. A number of research assistants have contributed to the project as well, and generous individuals who've helped to support this book with their encouragement, and who will support the exhibition with generous financial support. We also want to thank this evening 3 colleagues in particular here at Bowdoin who have helped make tonight's presentation possible: Tony Sprague, Suzanne Bergeron, and Elizabeth Humphrey. We also thank David Fram, who's played a very important role in preparing for this evening's presentation as well. We know that there are members of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art's Advisory Council with us this evening. We want to offer our thanks and to share our appreciation for everything that you do to support all that the BCMA offers, both to the community here at Bowdoin and so far beyond. My final thanks tonight, Walter, is to you. We are so pleased that you could be with us to share some of your insights, to whet our appetite still further for the exhibitions and the further discussions that await us next year, and of course in the interim, looking forward to that exhibition. So the time is rapidly approaching 6 o'clock, and it's now our responsibility to conclude this evening's presentation, but we hope that we have left you with plenty of food for thought. Thank you so much for joining us online this evening, and we look forward to seeing all of you here in Maine when we are able to reopen the Bowdoin College Museum of Art safely, and certainly next summer in 2021. Have a lovely evening, and thank you for being with us.
And Anne and Frank, thank you both. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.